This is the McPherson Report. That's McPherson report.com.
I said it's so funky. I said it's so funky. I said it's so funky.
Fiercest fighting the federal troops ever encountered was against the Seminole. They ran Andrew Jackson out of there. But then Andrew Jackson put a spin on it and made himself like some great Indian fighter. They ran Andrew Jackson out of there. That's the one on the $20 bill, right? Where my money at? Where my money at? You know, that's funny, right? They be talking about in the hip-hop records, give me some Benjamins. Slave master. Andrew Jackson. A good Indian is what? A dead Indian. Now he on the $20 bill. He was a slave master. You know that, right? He had slaves. Andrew Jackson. You know? But offered himself as a champion of the little man against the rich and the privileged, right? He's slave master. Slave master. But they don't teach us that. Our children, in October, they cut out the little, you can go to any school in October, you'll see the little ships on the windows. Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria. You know, and in every school, everybody's championing Columbus. Where did Columbus learn the craft of navigation? He learned it with the Portuguese slave trade. He was in the Guinea trade, as they call it, up and down the west coast of Africa. That's where he learned the art of navigation, in the slave trade. It wasn't just that he took slaves. It was that he was in the industry, the enslaving industry. See, people think that the enslavement of Africans began here in the Western Hemisphere. It didn't begin in the Western Hemisphere. It began in Europe. At the time that Columbus started the slave trade, there were plantations up and down the Mediterranean. In fact, I think the word factory is a Portuguese term that relates to the enslaved peoples, the plantation. They didn't say plantation, they said factory. I think it's a Portuguese word. That system was already in effect in Southern Europe. So Columbus is bringing a system already functioning and putting that in place here. And when they couldn't, it didn't take long, right? When they couldn't continue, and you know, you really got to read. You really have to read. First of all, read John Henry Clark's book on Columbus. Read John Henry Clark. That's a good place to start. It's a little book. It's not a big book on Christopher Columbus. How they, and not just the fact that hundreds of thousands of the indigenous people, the Carib, the Ararat, the Boricua, and the Taino, not just the fact that hundreds of thousands of them died from diseases that were not indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, the Europeans brought with them, but the brutality. The brutality. Columbus himself told them that if they didn't bring him a thimbleful of gold every day, he would cut the fingers off of those that were working in the mines. It was either a thimbleful of gold or your finger. I mean, the brutality. When you read Galeano, how the Spanish conquistadors just killed people like they were dogs, cut women, pregnant women, cut their bellies open, nothing, like nothing. There had never been such brutality as was heaped upon the indigenous people. But when that didn't work, they went to get the African. Now, it's important to understand that people knew that this was wrong from the beginning. People talk about, well, Columbus was a man of his time. Well, George Washington was a man of his time. Now, you know George Washington was the biggest slaveholder. George Washington had 300 slaves. Had three or four plantations. I forget how many plantations he had. And they talk about these people, Thomas Jefferson. Well, they were men of their time. People knew this was wrong. They knew from the beginning. You even read Jefferson. Even Jefferson says at one point, I shudder to think that God is a God of justice. They knew this thing was wrong. Actually, Jefferson, in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, actually wrote about the abolition of slavery. He took it to the delegates the next day and said, are you out of your mind? All right, have you lost your mind? I mean, you got to remember, too, one of the aspects of the American Revolution was the fact that they were fighting for the right to continue slavery. People don't know that, right? They were one of the things they were fighting for, because the British were bringing the slave trade to an end before the United States. And remember, when the British fought the American colonists, they offered freedom to the Africans.
That's right.
This is true. Nova Scotia, Canada. Black community's been there for almost 300 years. You know where they descended from? They descended from the soldiers, the black soldiers that fought for the British when the war was over. Since they fought for the British, they knew they couldn't hang around. So they got on the boat, and the British took them to Nova Scotia. That's right. No, took them to Nova Scotia. They were free people. Took them to Nova Scotia. But they had to get out of here because they'd been fighting for the British. Now, initially, the colonists did not offer freedom, but when it became clear that there was a shortage of manpower and they needed more troops, then Washington began to offer freedom. Today, where New Jersey Pack is, if you go on the plaza, you'll see a monument there. It's a glass monument. When they first started to build the New Jersey Pack and they dug up that land, they found that there was a cemetery there. And that cemetery was a cemetery for the native indigenous people and the Africans. Because remember, this racial segregation thing was so deep, we couldn't even be buried together. You couldn't be buried in the white cemetery. So they dug this up and they found this cemetery. People's Organization for Progress was in existence then. And we actually had a protest at that site. And we stopped construction. You don't know, they don't print that up nowhere. We stopped construction. They had to bring in Gus Henningberg to negotiate. This is true. They had to bring in Gus Henningberg because we was out there protesting every day. And you know, Prudential, they don't want no band name, right? And you know, that movie Poltergeist had come out. You know where the ghost came from in Poltergeist, right? They had built that housing development on what was Native American burial land. That's why the evil spirits was out there. So they didn't want that bad publicity. So they had Gus negotiate with us. So eventually they had to abide by the law because they are federal laws. Because this is not a new occurrence. But they be digging up stuff and they dig up somebody's cemetery. So they had to bring in the anthropologists and they had to bring in all these people and they had to move the bones and all of that. And what we said, we wanted a monument there that would show that this had been a place where slaves had been buried. And so you go there and you'll see the names of people that were buried in there, Native American and African. And one of them is Jack Cujo. Jack Cujo was a slave that fought in the American Revolution from Newark, New Jersey. And Jack Cujo was a great fighter, distinguished himself on the battlefield, survived the American Revolution, and did get his independence. Not only did he get his freedom, he got some land. Where the Star Ledger building is now is where the farm of Jack Cujo was. You go into Newark, down there on Washington Street. The Star Ledger building is between Washington and University and Court, right? That's where Cujo's land was. And he became a prominent businessman. Began to import, is that right? Imports when you bring in?
Yes.
He began to bring in exotic plants from Africa and sell them to the colonists. And he became a wealthy man. A book just came out written by an African brother. And I think Cujo was Ghanaian. And I think the brother that wrote the book is Ghanaian. He just wrote this book last year on Jack Cujo. So there were some Africans who did benefit from the American Revolution. They became fighters, and some of them did. Not all of them, but some of them did get their freedom, and they got land. But it did not bring about the abolition of slavery. That took a civil war. And this 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation and black people's 400-year project for social justice and freedom. It's one project. Only in books are there chapters.
Yeah.
Life does not, you ever know, life does not have chapters. You did not begin chapter 1 of your life. Oh, I finished chapter 1, now I'm going to chapter 2. Life does not have chapters. Life does not have episodes. You do not tune in next week to this episode of your life. Is one continuous project that we've been fighting. One continuous project. And the other thing to keep in mind is about slavery is that it was a process that started with wherever the first resistance was to the first enslavers and continued on the ships. You know the story of the Amistad and Cinque, you know, and the slave rebellions that were here. But we learned Lincoln freed the slaves. Now, I'm giving you my personal opinion, and I'm not a historian. I'm just a street corner agitator. But there is a kernel of truth in terms of the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation. But you have to also grasp the fact that emancipation, the actual process, acts of legal acts we're talking about, like the Abolition Act, goes back all the way to the 17th century. I mean, I think the first state to actually abolish slavery was Vermont. And I believe that was in 1777. And remember, when they abolished slavery, they didn't free all their slaves. What they did, they passed an act that would free the children of those who were enslaved. Because the first laws, because initially, enslavement was not coterminous with being black. Initially, there was a form of slavery called indentured servitude. The only difference was indentured servitude was for giving you a slave for a given period of time, like 7 years, I believe the length of the period was. And there were white indentured servants, and there were black indentured servants. Those first Africans that came to Jamestown, Virginia, August 23rd, 1619, did not come as slaves. They came as indentured servants. They were 20 indentured servants. So there's a whole period from about, well, if we're talking about the United States and the American colonies, let's say 1619, to about 1660, where it's like a gray area. and being black was not coterminous with being a slave. And there was even common cause. There were joint rebellions between white indentured, now not a lot of them, but there were some joint rebellions between white indentured servants and black indentured servants to do away with their indentured servitude and the awful treatment that they got. But roughly around 1660, the colonies begin to pass laws that explicitly say, if you're African and you're born in this colony, you are a slave, and the word is in perpetuity, which meant forever. That was the original intent, forever. It was no intent of you going to be liberated or emancipated and your children, no, in perpetuity. But people knew that this was wrong. This was the point I was trying to get to. They knew that this was wrong. Even in Europe. Now, Bartholomew de las Casas, he was on some of those ships, and he saw how the Europeans were treating the indigenous Native Americans. So there were big debates going on in whatever learned circles you had in Europe at that time, because this was still kind of close to the Middle Ages, right? But there were debates. And de las Casas' position was, and he was considered a great intellectual, his position was that you could not enslave the indigenous people because they had souls. They had souls. They were heathens, meaning non-Christians, but they had souls. They conceded that. They conceded that the indigenous people had some humanity. But initially, de las Casas said, but you can enslave the African because he has no soul. See, they were using everything. They had to put together an ideology that could justify this awful machinery of human exploitation and destruction called slavery. And the only way that they could do that is to, in fact, deny the humanity of the human beings that they were enslaved. So they used everything. The law, the sun, the moon, the stars, God, superstition, science, pseudoscience, everything they could to put together what became the ideology of racism. Because modern racism, as we know it, develops parallel to the slave trade in the Western Hemisphere. They had to develop an ideology that would enable them to justify. Because you can't be teaching this Christian principles, you know, and you out here chaining people up, branding them like cattle. I mean, read Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. And read his description of what they had to do. You know, Du Bois talks about what happened in the Middle Passage. You know, a lot of women gave birth. They took women that were pregnant and made them slaves, put them on the ship. These women gave birth on the ship. They tried to throw their children overboard. And many of them did throw their children overboard. Because they would rather kill their children than have their children grow up in this insanity, this torture chamber of slavery. They threw their children overboard rather than give them to the slave master. Many of them refused to eat, so they developed an implement. You saw the movie Django, right? You know, at one point they put Django upside down and he got this mask on. That's real. Now, there's a lot of problems with Tarantino's, with the film. But I will say this, there's some stuff in there that's real, with stuff that they were doing. So they developed all these implements, like they had this mask, this iron mask, right? Now we all grew up with the literary story, the Count of Monte Cristo. Is that the one? The man in the iron mask, and our sympathies, our hearts are out for the count because he's getting treated so bad. How could you put a mask, an iron mask on a man? This was commonplace for the African. Because they would refuse to eat. So they had to develop implements that they could break through the teeth and force feed them. Because they would rather do that because that was cargo. Everybody was a piece of money. And the job of the slave ship captain was to get that piece of money from Africa to the States. I had some members of POP. They went upstate one summer and they came back and they gave me a gift, a little box. And I said, what's in that box? They said, open it. And I opened the little box. And you know what it was? It was little chains. Little manacles. I have it. I should have brought it with me tonight. Little manacles for children. To chain up the children. You got to see these implements that they use. Branding irons, iron masks, funnels that can break through the teeth so that they can force feed. All kinds of implements of torture to enforce punishment. You know, the Christians sing a song, Amazing Grace. I like that song. I always like that song. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now, you know who wrote that song? A slave ship captain. He was a slave ship captain. And he was in the slave trade for more than a decade, trading in human beings. And then he became a minister. And to my knowledge, never took a strong stand on abolition. Because you know that the Bible was used to justify slavery. Now, I don't want to step on anybody's sensibilities here. If I was to identify myself, I would probably say I'm some kind of Christian. I don't know what kind. Some kind of Christian. But you got to understand that religion was used to justify the enslavement of our people in many ways, not just in one way. I mean, they would take right out of Paul, servant, obey thy master. You know, the Asiento, the papal bull that drew the dividing line in the Western Hemisphere, gave one side to the Spanish and one side to the Portuguese, and said that you can be in dominion. Now, what word is like dominion? Dominate. The Catholic Church, even. The Catholic Church. Many of them ships, before they left port, were blessed by priests on their journey.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. True. True. Yeah.
It's hard. It's hard. It's hard to talk about this. It's hard. That's why, you know, we talk to our people, and people say, I don't want to hear that black stuff.
Yeah.
Am I right? And some of the ones we be struggling against the hardest, our own family, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to hear that black stuff. I remember, like, when I first started to learn about Malcolm X, and this was back in the 60s. You remember them little record players that used to fold out, had the speakers, you know, to fold out, played the 45. I had a little record player, and I had gotten me a Malcolm X, I think it was Message to the Grassroots. And I was playing that, my mother said, I don't want to hear that Muslim stuff in here. Right?
Yeah.
And I love my mother, but that's what was going down. That was the truth. In my family, it ain't hardly talk about politics, but in my family, the only one discussion I can remember them ever having about civil rights, they were saying Dr. King should stick to civil rights when he came out against the war in Vietnam. But a lot of black people were saying that. It wasn't just my family, because we parrot whatever the media is saying, right? King came out against the Vietnam War. They came down on him. He should stick to civil rights. We all want he should stick to civil rights. Yeah. Donald Tucker, who passed away, the councilman in Newark, would tell the story about how in '67, King couldn't hardly get a church in Newark that would let him come in there and preach because they came down so hard on King for coming out against the war in Vietnam that a lot of the preachers were scared to have King come in their church. Because they felt they might get some of the medicine that he was giving. Because he went in a day, from being the most popular, loved darling of the media to being public enemy #1. In a day. They can turn it on and they can turn it off. You know?
Funky mellow groove. Funky mellow groove. Funky mellow groove.